Suppose you are very interested to know more about the medieval India. What will you do for that? As in, what will you do to gather information? Firstly, you will consult your textbook. And along with that, you will visit your library from where you will be able to gather a couple of books which will provide you information on medieval India. These books have been written by historians and scholars, and from these books we get to know about our pasts, about different things that happened in the past. But I'm sure a very pertinent question might have crossed your mind at some point of time. How do the historians and scholars know so much about times that happened not just centuries ago but thousands of years ago? Because they did not get this knowledge from nowhere. So how did they get this knowledge? To this end, the historians and scholars have lots of sources of information to rely upon. But what are these sources of information? And how authentic and reliable are these sources when it comes to understanding our past through these sources alone? Now, this is one of the strands of discussion that we will be pursuing in this lesson. So now let us imagine ourselves as historians and see what sources of information we can gather. From this, we will also question how reliable and authentic these sources of information are. So from this, you must be thinking that this will be a very fascinating adventure. So let us now embark on this journey and begin this discussion on historians and the sources of information. Now, allow me to give you an example so that you can understand one of these sources of information in a better kind of way. If I ask you to write an essay on the last place you toured, you will be taking out a page from your notebook or you will begin writing in your notebook itself. But do you think paper was always readily available to human beings? In our previous lesson as well, we talked about how we take for granted so many things that we get and see around us. But these were not the things that were found in ancient and medieval times. And when we talk about the things that were not found in ancient and medieval times, we will have to keep in mind the instance of paper. Now, what did people write on in the absence of paper? In the absence of paper, people used to write on palm leaves, stones, or monument walls. So can you understand how interesting this must be? Because the absence of paper does not imply that people did not write. People have to write in order to record various events in time. People have to write in order to make those events accessible to people who will be coming in subsequent generations. And due to the lack or absence of paper, people in ancient times used to write on leaves, stones, or walls. Now, these were known as inscriptions because these writings were inscribed on the walls. So, this was a very tedious process to make inscriptions on these hard surfaces like monuments or stones. But this is a process in which information was recorded in ancient times. From the ancient times, let us now travel to the medieval times. What do we see here? In the medieval times, paper now started becoming more available and cheaper. So people now started writing on paper. The use of paper started increasing. Now, with the use of paper, another very important question must be coming to your mind. What did people write on paper? As in, what were the various kinds of information, the various kinds of records that people wrote on paper? People used to write about holy texts, chronicles of rulers, letters, teachings, petitions, judicial records, and registers of accounts. So you can see a host of different things used to be written on paper after the use of paper started increasing. And the subjects of things that were written on paper ranged from holy texts to registers of accounts and taxes. So you can see how religious things were also wrote on paper, how administrative and political things were also wrote on paper, how people wrote about the chronicles of different rulers, how letters, petitions and so many things were written on paper. Now when we come to talk about the use of paper, allow me to give you an example so that you can understand this lesson in a better way. Now, for every subject you get to study in your school, I'm sure you must have a couple of textbooks at the least. Now, in these textbooks, the lessons that you study are printed. So, the writers of these books got their writings printed on the textbooks. Now, suppose the printing technology had not developed by now. What would these writers have done? They would have had to write all these lessons on the textbooks. Now it sounds very tedious and quite impossible, right? Because there are so many books and it is almost impossible for the writers to write everything on the textbooks. You will be surprised to know that this is something that used to happen in medieval times. During this time, printing technology had not developed, which is why the writers used to write everything by hand, and these books and different kinds of documents that were written by hand were known as manuscripts. So what are manuscripts? A manuscript is any book or any written document that is written by hand. So we learned that manuscripts are any written document that are written by hand. Can you imagine how tedious this process might have been? Because it's so difficult to write so many things by hand. Just a while ago, we talked about the various subjects of the things that were written on paper. Those things included holy texts, chronicles of different rulers, petitions, laws, letters, and so many other things. Now, who do you think did the task of copying everything on paper? For this purpose, in medieval times, there were specialized people who were known as the scribes. Now, it was the task of the scribes to copy everything. So, the scribes were the people who copied the manuscripts. So, previously, things were written on palm leaves, as you can see here. And after the use of paper started increasing, books were now started being written. And this is how the manuscripts look like. Doesn't this look so beautiful? And in fact, you might be in disbelief to even imagine that this was entirely written by hand. This is so neatly done. And this work was done by the scribes who copied the manuscripts. Before proceeding with this lesson, let me ask you a question. People who used to copy manuscripts by hand in ancient times were known as copywriters, scribes, printers, or script writers. Will you be able to help me with an answer to fill in this blank? Well, people who used to copy manuscripts by hand in ancient times were known as scribes. Now, this discussion brings us to a very important question. Who stored those manuscripts? Because these manuscripts were huge. So many things were written in the form of these manuscripts. Now, who took care of preserving the manuscripts? The manuscripts were stored by the royalty, nobility, monasteries, and temples. Now, where were these manuscripts stored? These were stored in libraries and archives. Now, this gives birth to another important question. What are archives? An archive is a collection of documents and records that provide us information on the past times. These archives tell us about one geographical location or one period of time. Now, these archives play a very crucial role when the historians try to understand and construct the histories of the past times, because these archives include different kinds of documents like books, manuscripts, journals, newspapers, letters, and all these together provide us information All these together contribute to the process of creating history. And these manuscripts were stored by the royalty, nobility and other wealthy people in the libraries and archives. So this is a source of information that the historians rely upon. But from this, another very important line of discussion to pursue would be that the historians face different kinds of difficulties while deciphering the manuscripts. Why is it so? As in, what are the difficulties that are faced by the historians when they start studying and trying to understand these manuscripts? Now, before talking about the difficulties faced by the historians, let me ask you something. See this image. Is it possible for you to read and understand even a sentence from this? I guess you're not able to do so because this looks quite unclear and messy. It is not easy to understand and discern what is written on this page. Now, with this example, with this illustration in mind, let us now focus on the difficulties that are faced by the historians. Among the various difficulties that the historians face in deciphering the manuscripts, the first would be that many of these manuscripts were very badly written. How is it so? Now you have to keep in mind that these manuscripts were written by hand. And you cannot expect every scribe to have a very good handwriting, to have a very neat presentation. Now I'm sure you must have seen a doctor's prescription. More often than not, things are written in a very jumbled and messy kind of way in a doctor's prescription. Now, it must have been easier for you to understand had it been printed. So, in a similar kind of way, it is very difficult for the historians as well to read manuscripts which were written by hand, to read manuscripts which were not printed. Now, these messy and slovenly written manuscripts pose another major challenge to the historians. The historians embark on the task to understand the past times. They want to understand and create histories of the past times with utmost fidelity. But when they don't get to understand what is written on the manuscripts, they are compelled to guess what is written. Now, when a historian is guessing what is written on the manuscript, the historian moves away from the reality of the past. So, because of the unintelligible manuscripts, historians have to guess. They have to say with uncertainty what is written on the manuscripts. So, this is another challenge that the historians face when they sit to write and understand the histories of the past times. Now, along with these badly written manuscripts, another major challenge was posed by the scribes themselves. But how did the scribes pose any difficulty or impediment in this? We learned that the scribes were people who copied the manuscripts, and while copying the manuscripts, they often introduced small changes. Now, when a scribe is introducing a small change, the reality is changing to a certain extent. Now, when subsequently different scribes are introducing small changes to the same manuscript, those small changes do not remain small any longer. This is because when many people are introducing changes to the same manuscript, the manuscript now looks very different. Because at the hands of different scribes, the manuscripts also get altered. The manuscripts also get changed. And because these manuscripts get changed, it has often been seen that the original text has become very different from one manuscript. And this one manuscript can also differ from another manuscript that has been copied by another scribe. So this now poses a big problem to the historians, because they don't get to understand what happened in reality, which is the original thing. So many scribes have introduced their own changes, they have made their own modifications in accordance with their wish, and this in turn changed the reality of the past times itself. With this in mind, let us now go to the example that we took up in the beginning of this lesson. Considering you are still interested to know more about medieval India, you have your textbooks to rely upon. Now in these textbooks you have all the information properly printed. But when it comes to the historians and the process of making history, the process of constructing history, this process is not easy. It's very tedious. Because here we learnt about the various challenges that the historians face while deciphering manuscripts. Firstly, many of these manuscripts are badly written, which is why these are unintelligible, and it's very difficult for the historians to understand what is written in those. Simultaneously with that, the scribes also introduced their modifications in accordance with their wish, and this detached the history or the manuscript from the reality. Now these are some of the problems that the historians face, and to this end historians have to read varied versions of the same manuscript, because different versions of the same manuscript will give different stories, and from this it is the task of the historian to understand what happened and what was written originally. Now you will be surprised to know that along with the scribes who introduced small changes, the authors also revised their chronicles at different times. Because at the hands of different authors, the manuscripts or their chronicles were revised. There have been many revisions after a final book has been written. Now this brings us to a question. What is a chronicle? A chronicle is any piece of written history or any written document that is written chronologically. That is, the event that happens at first will feature at first, and it will be followed by events that come later in time. Now let me give you an example so that you can understand what a chronicle is. Suppose I am talking about the period between 1550 and 1600. Now when I start chronicling this time, or when I start writing a chronicle on this period, I will begin with 1550, and then the subsequent years will come, and this will be ended with 1600. So a chronicle is something in which events are recorded in a chronological manner. As an example of the point we just mentioned, let us take into account the 14th century chronicler Ziauddin Barani. Now Ziauddin Barani wrote two versions of his chronicle. The first version was written in 1356 and the second version was written in 1358. So can you understand how in the hands of a chronicler or an author, one chronicle or one piece of information can undergo changes over the years? Now when historians were studying his chronicles, that is the chronicles of Ziauddin Barani, you will be surprised to know that these historians did not know about the existence of the first version until the 1960s. The historians in fact knew only about the later version. So in this way the process of understanding history also becomes very difficult, because when the historians did not know about the existence of the first version, they were not able to understand what this chronicler had written initially. They were constructing their history on the basis of what they found in the second version, and after few years they found the first version. Now this is something that happens when historians are studying and working on piles and piles of manuscripts. So many important pieces of information get buried under these piles of manuscripts. Now as historians, scholars, or even as students of history, it is imperative on our part to acknowledge the differences in the contexts when we study historical records from the past. What does this mean? We have to take into account the different contexts in which information was produced. we also have to take into account the background of the person who wrote that piece of information. Now allow me to give you an example so that you can understand this better. Now, the history of any ruler, when it has been written by a court historian whom the ruler has commissioned, will be very different from the history that will be written by a foreign traveler. Because the court historian will show the rule of that ruler in a specific kind of way. The court historian will be producing that history, or the court historian will be producing that information in a different context. And when a foreign traveler from a different land visits the court of the same ruler, that person will produce information and history in a different kind of way. So the difference in the contexts in which this information has been produced needs to be taken into account. The social standing and the background of the person who has written the history will have to be factored in when we sit to understand and decipher historical records of the past. This now brings us to an end of our lesson on historians and the sources of information. Now this was a very enriching lesson in the sense that we got to know how historians know what we know about the past, because it is not possible for me or you to understand what happened hundreds and thousands of years ago. For this, historians rely upon different kinds of sources like manuscripts, and these manuscripts are documents that were written by people in the past. Now these manuscripts also pose different challenges to the historians, like many of these manuscripts were badly written, many of these manuscripts, fragile as they were, also got destroyed over time. Many of these manuscripts are almost unintelligible and indecipherable, which is why historians have to guess what is written on those manuscripts. Now, different versions of the same chronicle also pose a challenge to the historians, because it is difficult for them to understand which was written originally. Now from this, we went on to understanding the difference in the contexts in which information is produced, because we cannot take for granted any source of information. We have to question the foundation of information. We have to question how and when and in which context that information was produced. So this is the end of our discussion on historians and the sources of information. In a subsequent lesson, we will be dealing about the various kinds of information that we get to know from these sources. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon. You can also register for free at DeltaStep.com or download the DeltaStep app to learn one-to-one with our amazing teachers, or to get access to all our 5,000 plus amazing videos as per your school syllabus. Master each topic with our adaptive practice technology. Get million plus questions with step-by-step solutions and unlimited mock tests. Get all your doubts resolved instantly. Learn via games and win amazing prizes like PlayStations and iPads. So at DeltaStep, learning is not just fun and easy, it's rewarding too. So register for free now.